Okay, go.
Okay. What do you want me to just tell about early childhood?
Yeah, just like your favorite childhood memories and
Oh, let's see.
your childhood.
I had, well, when I was real little, we lived in West Yellowstone, Montana. Do I look at the camera or you? The camera?
Maybe I'll move the camera so that it's like in front of me.
And
Okay.
and my memories of West Yellowstone, I can still remember that. I was just little. I was only maybe 3 or so, and I remember we lived in this little town. It was right on the edge of Yellowstone Park. It was the west entrance of Yellowstone Park. And we lived there year round for about 4 years. So, yeah, I guess when we left there, I guess we did live there about 4 years, but we left there maybe about 3 years, I guess. But I remember it was kind of a fun place to live. In the wintertime, it was really cold and it snowed an awful lot. And my dad had a job where he ran what they called in those days a cabin camp. It was about 12 or 15 little log cabins that they rented out, mostly during the summer when tourists had come to the park. And but I can remember it snowed so much that it would bury the cabins. And going with my dad just across the flat, level part of the snow, and digging out the chimneys of those cabins so that somebody didn't step in them when they were crossing the snow, and then have their leg go down into the chimney and maybe break their leg. I remember that I had a pair of little red skis. They were probably only a couple feet long. And I used to ski on those things, and it was fun. I enjoyed that. And I had a couple of friends. One kid's name was Rocky. I remember Rocky. He was, I don't know where he lived, because in the wintertime we lived in town. In the summertime we lived out of town a little ways. And I can't remember, Rocky must have lived in town, but I don't remember much about him. But we had a good time together. And we used to ski off the side of the houses and things in the wintertime. That was kind of fun. But when we moved up here to Washington, of course I grew up in Bremerton basically, and we lived in a housing project there, and it was a big housing project, and it was built for workers in the Navy Yard in Bremerton where my dad worked, and there was lots of kids, and we had a good time. We had a lot of friends, and a lot of kids in that project. That across the street from the house, or across the street from the project, was this woods, and we'd go over there and play in the woods. And we had a good time there. We'd build forts and things. And I basically grew up there during the war, and the Second World War, and it was a very interesting place to live. And we were very interested in the war, and I remember lots of things about that. I remember when the war started and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, my dad tried to get in all the services he could try, but he couldn't get in any of them because he didn't qualify. But he did get in the Coast Guard Reserve, and he spent some time in the Coast Guard Reserve, but just around Bremerton on a patrol boat that they would send out into the bay, and it would go between Bremerton and Seattle looking for, I guess, Japanese submarines, because they were always worried about those submarines coming into Puget Sound. And but basically, the story he told was that they were out there to rescue any sailors who got drunk and fell off the ferry going between Bremerton and Seattle, and I guess they did that at least once while he was in the Coast Guard Reserve. It was fun. We had a good time. I had a lot of good friends, and I don't know, basically what else about my early childhood. I remember when I was, I don't remember this, but I remember people telling me about it, that when I was born, I was in pretty bad shape, and but I survived that. But my feet were back up against my legs. Instead of being down, they were up flat against the tops of my feet were flat against my legs. And we lived at that time with my grandmother and grandfather, who was my mother's dad and mother. And Grandma would massage my feet and pull them down to where they should be when I was a baby. I remember him telling about that. And they had, Grandma had a great big huge stove. And it was a wood burning stove that they used for heat and for cooking and things. And above the stove were these warming ovens, and the story goes that she used to put me in those warming ovens to keep me warm, because it got really cold in Idaho. She lived in St. Anthony, Idaho, and it was just about 100 miles south of Yellowstone Park, and it got really, really cold there. And so the story goes that she used to put me in that oven to keep me warm, and that's why my dad always said I was half-baked, because I spent some time in that oven. I don't know what else. We had good times, though. I remember getting together, as aunts and uncles and cousins and things. And then, well, of course, when we moved up here, we didn't see him much. My dad had a brother that lived in Bremerton, and a sister who lived in Bremerton. But they only had one. His brother only had one daughter, and I liked her a lot. We got along good. About the same age. She's a couple years older than I am, I guess. So, and I don't know what else.
Did you play any sports when you were a kid?
Oh, I tried. When I was growing up in the project there, it was called East Park. We had teams that we got together in neighborhoods, and we were called the East Park Lions. And we had baseball and football teams. I don't think we ever played basketball much, but we played a lot of baseball and a lot of football. And this is when I was like maybe, 10, 11. And we'd play there were other projects around that we played against, and then eventually we all went to school together and played ball. I tried to play basketball, but I wasn't very good, and so I didn't do very well at it. But I had a lot of fun. When I was in high school, I tried to play, but I wasn't that good, so I never really got to play much. But just playing neighborhood stuff, I was able to do that. So it was basically baseball, football, but then when I got a little older, we started playing basketball at school, and that was the one I really liked best, was basketball.
Okay, I'm gonna. Okay. How much did things cost when you were a kid?
Oh, then when I was a kid, you got a lot of stuff for not much money, but there wasn't a lot of money around because it was right towards the end of the Depression and right as the World War II broke out, and people didn't make much money. So there wasn't a lot of money, but you could buy a really big candy bar for a nickel, and you could buy a bottle of pop, and they all came in bottles in those days. They didn't come in cans. You could buy a bottle of pop. They were only 8-ounce bottles. You could buy that for a nickel. And you could go to the movies for 15 cents for a kid under 12. And I think if you were over 12, it was 25 cents. And so I would, there was a movie theater really close to where I lived in Bremerton. And all the kids would go there. They'd have Saturday afternoon matinees, and they'd have these serials that were continued on, stories like superhero type guys, and everybody would go to that. So I'd get a quarter a week, and I could go to the movie and buy a great big, huge, big bag of popcorn for a dime. And so it wasn't very expensive. I remember that during the war, they had rationing stamps, and my mother would send me to the store, which was not far from where we lived, a little grocery store, and she would give me the money and a list of what I was supposed to get and the ration stamps, and she would always tell me, if you lose anything, lose the money, don't lose the ration stamps, because it was really hard to get those ration stamps. During the war, things like sugar and meat and butter and those kind of things were rationed, and you didn't get very much. You got maybe a pound of sugar a week or whatever, and so. But things weren't very expensive. But then the people working only made like maybe I had a cousin that worked in a movie theater in Idaho in St. Anthony, and she sold tickets, and she ran the concession stand, and she got 20 cents an hour. So she had to work a long time to make even $1, and so it wasn't. Things were, as we think of them today, were very cheap, but people didn't make that much money, so it was tough. But and I don't know what bigger things cost. I think we lived in this project house. That was, it was an apartment. It was a pretty nice apartment. It had 2 bedrooms and a pretty nice apartment, 2-story upstairs and downstairs. The bedrooms and the bathroom and everything were upstairs, but I think we paid, that I can remember, I think it was like about $35 a month, and that included everything except the telephone. And some people had phones and some people didn't in those days. But my dad worked in the Navy Yard in Bremerton, and people who worked in the Navy Yard for the government, they got paid pretty good. He probably, for those days, this was back in the early 40s, and he probably got $100 a week. And that was considered really good money in those days. So they we always got along pretty well. I never ever gone without anything that we ever really wanted. We didn't always have a car because gasoline was another thing that was rationed, and you could only drive. You only got so many gallons a week or a month, whatever it was, and you had a little sticker on the windshield that said what kind of priority you. If you had an A sticker, you got more gasoline than if you had a D sticker. But the average person who had a car, and not everybody had cars in those days, the average person had a C or a D sticker, I think. And just people who had a lot of priority, a lot of maybe government jobs, had an A sticker and had to use their car. So those kind of things were all rationed, and it wasn't very easy, but it was easier than it had been during the Depression. They didn't have anything to speak of. I don't know what else.
Okay. What do you remember about your grandparents? You kind of talked about it, but...
Oh, I knew my mother's parents better than I did my dad's. I don't ever remember my dad's father. He passed away when I was just real small. Excuse me. This is probably ruining your production here. My grandparents, my mother's dad and mother lived in this little town of St. Anthony, Idaho, and they'd lived up in what they called Teton Basin before that, where they'd lived most of their adult lives. And they were very, very good. I remember my grandmother. I don't remember a whole lot about my grandfather because he passed away when I was probably 4 or 5 or 6. And but my grandmother was really, really nice. She was really a good gal, and she always would fix you nice things to eat when you'd go to visit her. And we didn't go that often, but we went when we moved up here to Washington. When I was a teenager, we were set up so that we could go. We probably went every summer back to Idaho and to Utah, where my dad's folks were. And I really enjoyed that. I really looked forward to going to seeing Grandma. And I had an aunt that lived with her, Aunt Annie, and Aunt Annie was crippled. And so she lived with Grandma all of her life. And Grandma would live in this little house in St. Anthony, and I'd go down there, and we'd go down there, and I'd spend a lot of time with her, but I had a lot of cousins that lived in that town too, so we'd spend a lot of time. But Grandma was really, really a nice gal, and she just really did everything that she could to make everybody feel real welcome and everything. She was, I guess she lived to be in her 80s, and I remember when she was quite elderly, going to one of her birthday parties, and someone gave her a purse for a present. It was one of the neighbors' ladies, one of her friends from church, and she really didn't like the purse, and so she would speak out loud sometimes the things that she was thinking. And she took one look at this purse and she said, "Oh, I wouldn't take that ugly thing to a blackout." And here's a woman that gave her the purse that's sitting there, you know, and it embarrassed my mother and all of her sisters. My mother had 5 or 6 sisters, and 4 brothers. And the sisters, let's see, there was 1, 2, 3. 3 of the sisters lived in St. Anthony. One of them still lived up at Teton, and the other one lived in Salt Lake. And then Aunt Annie too. She was there, always there too. So in the summertime, pretty much they'd all come to St. Anthony, or we'd go up to Teton Basin, where the family lived. And my grandfather had homesteaded there in Teton Basin in 1883, I think. He went up there and homesteaded a farm at 100, and I don't know what they got, 160 acres, I guess, the Homestead Act, and they lived on that farm until my grandfather was quite elderly, and then they moved to St. Anthony, which was about 50 miles west of Teton Basin. Teton was right on the border between Idaho and Wyoming, and at the base of the Teton Peaks. And that farm is still in our family and is run by, I'm not sure now for sure whether there's anybody living on it or not now, but there was up to just a few years ago. One of my cousins ran it. And so it's been in our family since 1883, I guess. So it was well over 100 years that farm has been in our family, and but that was my grandparents. I really liked going to their place because it was a lot of fun. They lived right on the edge outside of St. Anthony, right on the edge of town, and kind of out into the fields and things, and it was fun. We went there every summer. My dad's mother, as I said, I didn't know her very well. I didn't know my grandfather or his dad at all. And Grandma Peck lived in Salt Lake, and I can remember she lived for a while in a little apartment. And we'd go whenever we'd go there maybe every summer or every other summer. And we'd always go down there to Salt Lake and see his relatives where they all lived, most of them. And going to see Grandma Peck, she was a little tiny, short gal, kind of she wasn't very, I never thought that she was very friendly. You know, she wasn't used to kids, and she lived by herself, and then as she got older, she moved in with one of my dad's sisters, who lived in Salt Lake, well, her daughter, and she lived there, and I can remember her being kind of crippled and kind of bedridden, and I don't remember much about her, too much, but she was okay. I mean, she just wasn't, didn't know her very well. But she had been born and raised in southern Utah, a little town called Orderville, which was a United Order community where everybody had everything in common and everyone kind of helped each other, and she grew up there in that little town until the United Order experiment by the church was discontinued, and then I guess they moved to Salt Lake then, but they were good, and they were pioneers. They were the old Mormon pioneer family, both sides of the family, both my dad's side and my mother's side. My dad's side wasn't extremely active in the church, but my mother's side was. My grandfather had been the bishop of the little ward out there in Teton, and he had the little community they lived in was called Bates, and that was their name. It was named after him. His name was Thomas Bates, and he was the bishop of the ward out there, and they were all very active. I can remember when after I got back from my mission, going with my mother and dad down there, and we went to church in the Bates ward. And it was just a little building. I mean, it wasn't a building like we have today. It was just a little country church. And there was probably 100 or maybe 110 people there in the congregation. And we were related to everyone except one family. And I remember sitting there with my grandmother and looking around, and she would say, "Oh, that's your cousin Flossie," or something. And I remember there was really a good looking, I was just back from my mission, I was maybe 22, and there was this really good looking gal leading the music, blonde, really, really cute, and I thought to myself, I wonder who she is, So I said to my grandma, "Who's leading the music here?" "Oh, that's your cousin Caroline." And another cousin, So I never got to know Caroline very well, though. But it was fun to go to church up there because I didn't realize that everybody in the congregation we would be related to. One of my uncles was the bishop. Another uncle was a counselor, and they were just very active in the church up there. So they were, on my mother's side, they were quite active. They used to have family home evening. I remember my mother telling about how they'd have family home evening way back in the, in 19-teens, in the 20s, when she was still at home. So they were very active. They have all social activities revolved around the church. And they would have different things, dances and things like that at the church. And everybody in the community, I guess, or everybody who wanted to, would go, and they would just put all the kids to sleep on the benches and the pews, and then they would have their parties wherever in the building there someplace. But it wasn't a very big building, so I don't know how many people they could have got in there, but probably not many. But they were good people. My grandparents on both sides, they were pioneer heritage people who settled that country.
What about your parents? Like, you talked about your grandparents. What about your parents' siblings? Did they have siblings?
Yeah, my mother had my mother's family. She had 6 sisters and 4 brothers, but the brothers were half brothers. My grandfather, her dad, had been married before to a gal, and he and a friend of his had gone up to Teton Basin in Idaho to settle, and they married sisters, and his friend's name was Stephen Foster, not the guy that wrote the songs, but the guy named Stephen Foster, and he married a woman. He married a gal who became my grandmother. Now this is really a screwed up way of doing things, but he married my grandmother, Stephen did. And they had 4 boys. And my grandfather married my grandmother's sister, I guess. And so, but Stephen Foster, the woman who became my grandmother, her first husband died, and so did my grandfather's wife. she died. And so my grandfather married my grandmother. And so the boys, my mother's brothers, some of their last name was Foster, and some of them took the name of Bates. I think two of them took the name of Bates, and two of them kept their original name, which was Foster. And then my grandmother and my grandfather, Thomas Bates, and my grandmother had the 6 girls, and my mother was the youngest of the 6. And so she had there were 10 kids in her family, and my dad had one. Let's see, he had 2 brothers, and Ruth, 2 sisters, and actually 3 sisters, but one died when she was a baby. And they lived in Utah. They lived in Pleasant Grove, which is close to Provo, and they lived in Tooele, which is out west of Salt Lake, out in the desert. And mostly he grew up in the Tooele area. And but my grandfather, his dad was a butcher, and he worked around different places. He would go from one community to another sometimes and work as a butcher. And it was kind of hard for them. They never had a very good. They never had much money, and they didn't have anything that you could, really count on. But my dad's parents and his brothers and sisters they were really good people. They really were. They'd do anything for you, and they were just really, really good people. But none of them had much religious training. They just didn't get it for some reason. Although both my grandmother and grandfather had been born into a religious pioneer family. They just they weren't active in the church at all. And my dad had a kind of a rough life when he was a kid. He tells the story about when he was a young teenager, maybe 14, 15, he would go and hire out during the summertime and work on different farms and things. And he went up to someplace in Idaho and was working, and he came when he was over for him to come home. He came home to Tooele and went to the house that they lived in, and nobody was there. It was vacant, and he didn't know where his folks were. He didn't know where his family was, And so he went to the store, the grocery store where my grandfather had worked, and asked to get the owner of the store there. Well, he says, I'm looking for my folks, and they're not at home. They're not in the house. The house is empty. And the owner says, oh yeah, he said they moved to Hayward, California. And they never told my dad. He didn't know they were gone. And he didn't know where Hayward, California was. He probably didn't even know where California was. But he looked on a map, and he found Hayward, California, and it's a town in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so he hitchhiked. I don't know what year this would have been. He was born in 1908, so it would have been in the early 20s sometime. And he hitchhiked from Tooele to Hayward, California. And then he just started going around asking different grocery stores if they knew his dad, and he found one of them that did, that he'd worked for him, and because he was a butcher and he would go from place to place. And so he found out where they lived, and he went up and knocked on the door in Hayward, California, and my grandmother opened the door, and she didn't say, "Oh, you know anything about it?" She said, "Oh, you found us, huh?" Like they were trying to get away from him, because they didn't really, he wasn't treated very well as a kid. They used to, they lived, when they lived in Twilla, they lived out of town a ways, and they would make him stay home. They'd take all the other kids, but they'd make him stay home. And when they got out of sight, when they went to town, when they got out of sight, he would run across country to town and meet him there. And then once he was there, they had to, you know, put up with him. But he wasn't treated very well by his family. So he had a kind of a tough life. But he got along really well with all his brothers and sisters. And eventually it was, there was his brother Art and his family lived in Bremerton, and Aunt Vera and her family lived in Bremerton for a while and moved to Tacoma, and there was an Uncle Ace who lived in Bremerton for a while. But he got along very good with his sisters and brothers. So, but he didn't get along very well apparently with his mother and dad. So I don't know. They probably had their reasons. I don't know why.
Okay, so let's start with World War II stories.
World War II. Well, I grew up, my growing up years was during World War II. And I can remember when the war started, I was probably, let's see, I was born in 36 and the war started in 41, so I was probably 5 or 6 years old. And I can remember that everybody was really, really excited about when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and my dad worked in the Navy Yard in Bremerton, and they were very concerned because they thought the Japanese were coming any minute, and they had. It took them a while, but within a week or so, they had anti-aircraft guns and all kinds of those kind of things around town. And in fact, in where we lived, there was a big field, and they had an anti-aircraft gun and a little barracks there where the soldiers lived that ran this gun. And they had, I can remember one time, they had blackouts. You had to hang blackout curtains in front of your windows so that there would be no light after dark could get out. And because they were afraid Japanese were going to come over there and bomb the Navy Yard there in Bremerton, because it was a big Navy Yard. And so they'd have those blackout curtains. I remember they had searchlights. And one night, the sirens went off and the searchlights started going all over the sky. And they found some little private plane who had strayed into the area. And they pinpointed that little plane. They thought it was maybe a Japanese plane, but it wasn't. It was just some private pilot. But he must have really been scared, because in those days they didn't have much in the way of radio communication unless you were military. And so he had all these searchlights shining on him, and he knew that the anti-aircraft guns were probably trained on him too. And I can remember going after they bombed Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning, and we went downtown in Bremerton Sunday afternoon. We had a car, and I kind of don't know why we didn't have a car, but we did. And we went down into Bremerton, and they had at every major intersection in Bremerton, they had machine gun nests set up with big sandbags all around, and they had machine guns, and it was I'm messing up your thing with my coughing here. But they had, in Bremerton, there was mainly Navy and Marine Corps. And so they had all these Marines manning these machine guns. And that was really interesting to me as a little kid to see those machine guns right downtown in Bremerton, at all these intersections. Because, as I said, they were expecting the Japanese to come anytime, but they weren't sure that they would, but they were prepared for them. And then a little later on in the war, they had what they called barrage balloons. And they were great big, kind of like blimps, only smaller than the blimp. But they were on cables. And they would let these, they would run these balloons up on the end of cables, and they'd have them at varying heights around the city. And you can see them. You walk outside and you can see all these balloons up of you. And they were big, they were huge. And it prevented, in those days they didn't have, or at least they didn't have many high-level bombing planes. If you bombed, you had to dive down and like a dive bomber and drop your bombs. And so they had these cables attached to the balloons so that the planes couldn't dive down because they'd get caught in the cables. And those are all over the place, and occasionally one would get away, cable would break or something, and they would go flopping across the sky, dragging the cables. I remember one time it came over our house, and there was a storm, the wind was blowing hard. One of these things got loose, and it drug its cables right across the roof of our house. We thought it was going to take the roof off, but it didn't. So it was very interesting during World War II, and I can remember we lived in this housing project that was run by the Navy, run by the government, and it was mainly for people who worked in the shipyard and military families. And they would bring up, this would be later in the war, maybe 44, 45, 43, somewhere 44. They would bring prisoners up there into the project, and they would cut the grass and weed the flower beds and do yard work and stuff. And we would be very intrigued with them. Now at this time I was probably 8, 9 years old, and all the kids we were all about the same age. All the kids were very intrigued with these prisoners because they'd have big PW or sometimes just P, but usually PW on the back of their overalls painted on there, and they would have guards. These Marines would be guarding them, and the Marines would have their rifles, and we were just little kids, and so we were really, really intrigued. So we'd follow these work crews around, and watch them, And they weren't Japanese. They must have been Germans or Italians or something, because they weren't Orientals. They were Caucasians. And then occasionally they'd have just a regular military prisoners that had gotten in trouble, and they put them in the brig. So they put those guys out there doing too. But most of them had PW on the back of their shirts, and that was really interesting. I remember that. And then the war progressed, and eventually it ended, and then my dad worked in the shipyard for, I don't know, probably through most of the Korean War, and then he left the shipyard and bought a grocery store. and ran the grocery store for about 20 years or more. But the war years were very interesting. A lot of military guys, the ships had come in and out of town to be repaired. You know, they'd come in from the Pacific, and the guys would repair them and send them back out. Occasionally, there'd be a British ship or a French ship. They'd come in, and so those sailors were very interesting to us. You know, we'd see the different uniforms and so forth. So that was kind of it was very interesting as a kid to grow up there. And of course, we'd go over to those woods that were across from the project and play army, you know, and stuff. So it was a lot of fun. We had a good time.
Okay. So you only have one sister, Mary. Did your parents want to have more than two kids?
I don't know. They didn't talk about it much, you know. Mary came along in 45, August of 45, and I was born in January of 36, so she's about 9.5 years younger than me. And it was we were very glad, I was very glad to have a sister, and we had a good time growing up. I remember when school would end, in school year would end, it was kind of a tradition that if you had a younger brother or sister, the last day of school was, the way they worked in those days, the last day of school was about an hour or two long, and you'd get your report card and tell everybody goodbye, and then summer vacation would start. And it always started on the first Friday of June. Whether the first Friday was the 1st of June or whether it was the 7th of June, it was always the first Friday you got out of school. And so the tradition was that if you had a little sister or a little brother, you'd bring him to school that day. And so I remember Mary went at least once, and parents would always dress them up, you know, real fancy and stuff. And she went, and we had a good time. And she used to, as she got older, it'd be my job kind of to babysit her or watch her if my mother wanted me to. And I had, she had a buggy, a baby buggy, and whenever they'd go someplace, they'd put her around in the baby buggy. Well, when she went to sleep, when she took a nap, she usually took her naps in that baby buggy, and it was my job to push the baby buggy back and forth, and try to keep her asleep. I didn't like that too much. And then she had these records that she liked to listen to. Cinderella, and Snow White, and the Seven Dwarfs. I remember Cinderella mostly. And she loved to listen to those as she got a little older, you know, 5, 6 years old. And so we'd have to play those records, and I'd have to, and they were the story on the record, but then you also had a book that went along with it. And so I'd read the book to her as she would listen to the music on the record, you know, and things. And so she liked that, and that got kind of boring. I don't know. That was something she loved to do. But then she used to get me in all kinds of trouble. She won't admit to this, but I can remember if she'd get ticked off at me for some reason, she would go into whatever room I was in the house, and if my mother wasn't there, then she'd make a big ruckus. Stop doing that to me! Stop pushing me! Stop hitting me! And I wouldn't be doing anything. I'd just be sitting there or whatever I was doing. And so my mother or dad would hear her screaming, and they'd come in there, leave her alone, don't you bother her. And I hadn't touched her or done anything. She used to really think that was funny because she'd get me in trouble doing that. But we got along real good, and she's had a tough life though. She really has. After she got out of high school, she went to BYU for a year, and she enjoyed that, I think, and she did really pretty well there, and was majoring in home ec, but it was expensive, and we didn't have much money, and so she didn't get to go very long. And she married this guy who wasn't, who everybody thought was a good guy, but he turned out not to be a good guy, and so she hasn't had a very, wasn't the life she expected to have after she left home. But we had good parents, and they did everything they could for us. They provided us with a good living, and they taught us things, and they did all kinds of things. My dad wasn't always active in church, but my mother always was. She was in the primary presidency and Relief Society presidency, and did all the stuff you do when you're active in church. But my dad went occasionally and once in a while, and then he had a spurt where he was active for a while, but wasn't always active. But we had a good time. Next question.
Okay. What was your favorite food growing up?
What my favorite what?
Food.
Things?
Food.
Food. Oh, everything. My mother was really a good cook, and she did everything. She just made everything really good. All our dinners were good and everything. I can't ever remember, even when we didn't have a whole lot. We always had good dinners, and the holidays were very, very important. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, all those kinds of things were fun. We used to get together with my dad's brothers and sisters for family dinners, and they were always fun. And we just really had a good time. I don't know what anything favorite was. I don't know. Just everything. We just had lots of good stuff. I always had good, seldom if ever did we ever have dry cereal for breakfast. We always had, eggs and bacon, toast. Homemade this and homemade that. Everything pretty much was homemade in those days. So it was all really good. Had a good time.
You talked a little bit about it already, but what was your health like when you were a kid?
It was okay. I never was really sick. I had problem always with my left leg, but it never bothered me much. I mean, it was a little bit weaker than my other leg, but it wasn't. It didn't show up until later in life. But I had. When I was little, I had chicken pox and smallpox and measles. I had measles really bad, and there was one time I remember being in the hospital for, several days, and that's when they think I was about 10 or 11 or so, 12, I guess, and that was when they think I might have had polio. But they don't know for sure. I never was diagnosed with polio, but I grew up during the era when polio was real common. They didn't have the vaccines, of course, in those days. And I remember kids in our neighborhood. There were a lot of them when I lived in East Park. There were a lot of kids, and I remember at least 3 that I remember had polio. One of them really bad. One kid ended up in what they called an iron lung, which was the thing that breathed for you. The huge, big machine, like a big tube. And all he could do was lay in that tube, and with his head sticking out of the tube, and that was pretty sad. But the other kids, one kid came out of it okay, and I don't know what happened to the other one, but I remember there were at least 3 in our neighborhood that had polio, so it was very, very bad, in those days. But basically, you know, you had your colds and things like that, but I don't remember ever really being. I never broke a bone, never had any broken bones when I was a kid, and basically pretty good, I guess.
Okay, bear story.
Okay, this is when, my mother tells about this all the time, but this is when we lived in West Yellowstone, Montana, at the entrance to Yellowstone Park. And I was probably 3, about that age. And we lived in this little cabin out on the edge of town. And as you probably know, Yellowstone is known for their bears. And there were a lot of bears around. And we used to hear them come up at night around the cabin, and they were scary. I don't remember ever being really scared because I didn't know enough to be scared, I guess, in those days. And out in our yard, we had a couple of big planks. And I used to play on those planks and walk on them and play cars, I guess, and things like that out in the yard. And one day, my mother tells about, she heard a commotion out in the yard, and I was outside, and she was inside, and she came to the door and looked out the door, and here was a bear in the yard. And it was a brown bear or a black bear. It wasn't a grizzly, but there were grizzlies around. And I was hitting the bear on the back with a stick and trying to get it out of the yard, and it scared her to death because all the bear had to do was take one swipe, and I'd have been 3 miles down the road. But she screamed and hollered, and I think she beat on a pan, and the bear ran away. But I chased the bear out of the yard hitting him on the back with a stick. And so that's my bear story. But that they told that story all my life, so it must have happened, I guess. But we had all these bears that would come up around the cabin and so forth. So it doesn't sound impossible that something like that would have happened. Although I don't know why I would have ever, at that age, taking the stick and start hitting on a bear. But I didn't know any better in those days either, I guess. So that's my bear story. Can sit there and drink that and read my book and stuff while they were in school.
Yeah. They're good. They're good.
They are good. Yeah.
But now, they used to be 50 cents and now they're like 70 cents.
Yeah, it used to be really cheap. I think they were about, when I started buying them, they were like about, I don't know, 49 cents, something like that.
Yeah. Everything's going up. Okay. So, whoa.
I hope I don't look too ugly.
No.
I saw myself in the window the other day and I, oh man, really terrible looking.
Right. Okay, so should we just, because I don't know what order all these questions go in.
Yeah, that's alright. Just ask me a question now.
Okay. I need a pen really quick. Also, can I take Lucky's collar off because it jingles?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so it kind of makes it hard to hear.
Where'd he go? He'd just slip right off over his neck.
Okay. Hey, I made that. Look at there. Okay, Lucky.
Where is he? Oh, he's on here?
Yeah. Okay. I'll put it back on before I leave, but...
Okay.
Okay, so the first question we'll do is, how and when did you decide to go on a mission?
How and when? Okay.
Okay, hold on.
You'll probably edit it later on, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, so how and when did you decide to go on a mission?
Well, when I when I got out of high school, I never really thought about going on a mission. And when I got out of high school, I went into the Marine Corps. And I was in there long enough to go through boot camp, but my eyes weren't good enough. And so when I got through boot camp, they give you a really good physical. And they discovered that I'd had cataracts and didn't have any lenses in my eyes. Because in those days, they took the lens out when you had cataracts. So they discharged me medically. And so when I got home, and then while I was in the Marine Corps, I discovered the church, because prior to that I hadn't. I'd always, enjoyed being a member of the church, but I didn't go that often. Mainly because I was really bashful and shy, and every time I'd go, they'd ask me to give a talk. And I didn't want to do that, so I didn't go very often. And but when I was in the Marine Corps, they gave you time to go to church on Sunday mornings, and so I would go at first just to get away from the drill instructors, because they were really mean guys. And there was a stake president in San Diego, the San Diego stake president. His name was President Knudsen. And he would come every Sunday to our meetings, and he would talk to us. And there was probably about, on that base, there was probably, I don't know how many members there actually were, but there was about 25 that would come regularly. And so after I went the first time, I thought, this guy is really good, because he talked to each one of us individually, and he'd encourage us and everything. So every Sunday I would go back, and then when I got discharged, I thought, he's really a good guy. There must be something to this. So, and I remember the last time I was there, I told him I was being discharged, and he told me, he said, okay, he said, you go home, and he said, you get ready and you go on a mission, and he said, you come back down here and be a missionary. And I had no idea that I actually would, But when I got home, I started going to church, and I found that it was really interesting. And by that time I was almost 19. And in those days you went on a mission when you were 20. And so I started going to church, and prior to that I didn't have any priesthood. And so I went several weeks in a row, and we had a really neat bishop who wasn't much older than I was. He was probably in his late 20s. And his name was Bishop Willie, and he was really a good guy. And so he started talking to me about it, and not too much about a mission, but just coming to church. And so I went, and I learned a lot of stuff, and I thought, this is really neat. And then we had two missionaries in Bremerton that were really good guys, and they used to hang out at my dad's grocery store. And so I got to know these guys, and it was Elder Knighton and Elder Clausen, and they were very good guys. And so they'd come around, they'd go down to our house for dinner and different things. And so I got to know them really well, and I thought, this is really, this might be something interesting to do. So one day, one Sunday, I went up to the bishop and I said, I'm wondering what I have to do to go on a mission. And he said, well, he said, we just talked about you this morning in our bishopric meeting. So he said, I'm going to go talk to your dad and see what he thinks about it. So he went and talked to my dad, and my dad was all for it. And that surprised me a little bit, and because I didn't have any money saved particularly. I still had a little bit that I'd gotten from the Marine Corps, but that was maybe $100 was all about. And So anyway, then I went through the priesthood. Before that, I wasn't quite an elder yet when I talked to the bishop about being going on a mission. But I went through. I was a deacon, and I was 3 or 4 months later, I was a teacher, and then a couple months later, I was a priest. And I would go to the different priesthood classes, and here I was, 19 years old, about 6'3", with all these little 12-year-old deacons, and that's the way they used to do it in those days. And then I went to the teachers, and went to the priests, and finally got up to near my age group, you know. And but then I was I'd been home about 6 months, and they ordained me an elder, and then I was eligible to go. And so then I left. I left in September of 1956. And I got called to go to the California mission, which is what President Knudsen had told me I would do. And I always remembered that, you know. But I never did get to San Diego. I always wanted to go to San Diego because that's where he was, but I didn't get to go. I wasn't ever assigned to go down there. And it was probably a good deal because I may have run into some of my old drill instructors down there, because there was lots of Marines in San Diego. But not many of them were members of the church. But that's kind of how I got to go, and I was I really enjoyed it. But I was kind of apprehensive a little bit about going because I knew you had to go. I didn't know much about the church. I really didn't know hardly anything about the church. But I'd been with these missionaries, Elder Clausen and Elder Knighton, and one of them was transferred, and the other one didn't have a companion for about 4 or 5 days, and I went and was his companion for a few days. And so we would go around different neighborhoods in Bremen and the tract and knock on doors, and he had meetings, you know, scheduled, and so we'd go to those meetings, and so I get kind of an idea of what it was like. But I remember when I got down there, they didn't have the MTC like they have now, and so you would just go to the mission home, which was an old house that they had remodeled up on State Street between North Temple and South Temple, and you stayed there a week, and they had a big, several big areas where they had cots set up, and that's where you slept. And you had a companion, but I only saw my companion in that week. I only saw him maybe about 3 times, because he was a partier, and he would take off, and he would come to the meetings that we were required to go to. But then as soon as the meeting was over, he would, I guess, kind of sneak out, and he was gone all the time, sometimes way late into the night. And I couldn't figure out how he got into the building, because I'm sure they must have locked the doors somewhere along the line. But he would get in there, and he'd be there in the morning and so forth. But he was kind of a guy, but he was going to California too. He turned out to be a really good missionary. After about 6 or 8 months, maybe a year into his mission, he changed his ways and was a really good guy. But yeah, it was. I worked my way through the things, but that's about the way I decided to go. Okay, when I was called to what they called in those days, this was in 1956, it was called the California Mission. And it was basically Southern California. It began, the northern boundary was just a little bit south of Fresno, which is right basically in the middle of the state. And it went, the rest, everything south of that, maybe about 50, 60 miles south of Fresno, to the Mexican border in California, and then it took in the whole state of Arizona. So it was basically from Fresno south and then Arizona. And that was the California mission. And then from north of Fresno to the Oregon border was what they called the Northern California mission. But I was in just basically the California mission. And I spent about a year in California and a year in Arizona. And I really had a good time. It was the best experience of my whole life. It stands out as being, it really changed me, because for when I went, I wasn't quite as bad as I was when I was a teenager and so forth, but I was really bashful and backward, and I couldn't say a whole sentence without stuttering and stammering. I was really insecure, I guess. But then when I went out there, I thought, before I left, I just said to myself, if you're going to go, you got to do this and do it, And so I just made up my mind that that's what I was going to do. And I had to really, my first companion was really a good guy. And we didn't have trainers in those days like they do now, but my first companion had been out probably about a year and a half. And so he was well indoctrinated. He was really good. His name was Miller Gardner. And he was a big, tall, good-looking guy, and he was from Colorado Springs. And he knew it so much, and I would just, we had people that that were, he and his other companion before I got there had been teaching. And so they were up in what we called the higher lessons. In those days our lesson manual wasn't Preach My Gospel, it was what they called the Gospel Essentials. Principles of the Gospel, I think that's what it was. But there were 7 lessons, and the higher ones were like Book of Mormon, Plan of Salvation, First Principles, and that's where he had several of the contacts that we were teaching. And so he would go and he would give those lessons because I didn't know those lessons yet, and he would, and I would sit there and just was really enthralled with what he had to say, because I was learning as much or more than the contacts were that he was teaching to, And he was really good, and he knew the scriptures really well, and he could teach those lessons really neat. And I sit there and remember thinking, wow, is that what we believe? I didn't know that, and so it was just as good for me as it was for him, or it was for the contact. It wasn't, he already knew it, but he was really a nice guy, and we had a good time. And we in those days the missionaries didn't have cars unless they had a large area. But we had a large area. We took in all of West LA, and he had a car. And so, and then the other thing that we got to do was, it was just not long, a month or so, or a couple of months after the Los Angeles temple had been opened and dedicated. And they had, when people would go through there before they dedicated it, if they wanted to, they could fill out a card, a referral card. And they were like 3x5 cards, and we had I don't know how many we had. We had them stacked in the corner of our apartment, and they went up about not quite halfway to the door. So we had hundreds of those cards. And so because he had a car, and not many missionaries had cars in those days, and we had this big area, we would go around. We we would take a couple of days or 3, whatever days we had that we didn't have appointments for, and we would take a handful of those cards and go all over LA with calling on those people. And so that was a good experience, and we were able to meet with a lot of people who wanted to know about the church, and had gone through the LA Temple before it was dedicated. And a lot of them were Jewish people. There were a lot of Jewish people that lived in West LA, and we would go there to their house, and they really weren't interested per se in joining the church maybe, but they were curious because in the LA Temple, all the chairs that they had sitting around in the hallways and in little rooms and things, they were kind of a powder blue color, and they had a Star of David on the backs of the chairs, where you'd sit down and you'd lean your back against it on that part of the chair was a Star of David on every one of them. And the Jewish people were really interested why the Mormons had a Star of David in their temples. And so that was a good conversation piece. So we'd tell them about the tribes of Israel and how they were descended from Judah, and that we actually were their cousins because we were descended from Joseph. And that was, I don't know that how many of them really took to that, but it was an interesting conversation we'd have with them on that. But it was a good experience. And then I had a lot of good experiences. I had a lot of good companions. I only had one that I really didn't get along very well with. And he was just mad because he was my second companion. Elder Gardner got sent to I don't know where else, someplace else, and this elder came in. His name was Elder Ashcraft, and he was a nice guy. He was older than I. He was about I was 20, and he was probably about almost 30. And he'd been in the military and had gone on his mission after we'd gone through, I don't know, 4 or 6 years in the Army. And he was from St. Anthony, Idaho, where my grandmother was from. And so I talked to him about that, and that didn't impress him much because he'd been up in northern Arizona for a long time, and he'd been in these little towns, and he'd been out in the country, and that's what he liked. And then he was transferred back down into LA. He didn't like the crowds, he didn't like the big city, he didn't like the traffic, he didn't like anything. And so he was very domineering, and he'd tell me all the time, I'm the senior companion, you're the junior companion, you speak when I tell you to speak, and all this kind of stuff. So I didn't like him too much, but I wasn't with him that long. But let's see, what can I tell you? We had times when I went to Arizona, to Tucson, and I was in Tucson for about 7 months. And then they transferred me up over to eastern Arizona, and I was in Safford, which is where President Kimball was born and raised. And we would go, he had a sister that lived there, and she would invite us to dinner quite often, maybe about once a week. And she was very nice, little old lady, and she was really a good cook. She fixed us a lot of good stuff to eat. But we didn't have dinner appointments like the missionaries have now. It was just hit and miss. If somebody wanted to invite us, they would. And we didn't, we were pretty lucky if we got invited out maybe once a month. But I had a good time in Arizona. I liked Arizona an awful lot. There were a lot of members of the church there, and so it wasn't. We knocked on a lot of doors. I think I knocked on every door in Tucson at least twice or three times. And people would see us coming, and they would, you know, if they didn't want to talk to us, they wouldn't answer the door. And we'd go there. And one time we would go out, and then I was with this one elder who had a car, and we would go down to the little towns in southern Arizona, south of Tucson, and we would go find the bishop of the ward, if there was a ward in town, and there usually was. And we would tell them we were there, and then we would go knock on doors around the town, and they would mostly just little towns, maybe about like Linden or that size. Darn it, I keep coughing. And we had good experiences there. We went to this one little town. I can't remember what the name of it was, but it was just a little small place, and there was a big Catholic church there, and we parked the car, and we just parked it someplace, and we just started knocking on doors, and the priest saw us. Well, he came out of the church, I guess that's how he saw us walking down the street, and he didn't say anything to us, he just watched us. But then he followed us all over town, you know, and he would watch. And if anybody opened their door, he would make a little note. And so we thought, we're in his territory, and he's watching if anybody from his congregation lets us in. Nobody did. And there were a lot of Spanish in that town, and there were a lot of houses that didn't even have doors. They just had blankets hanging down. And they would come and pull the blanket aside, and they would, most of them would just say, no comprende, you know. But we figured they probably did, but they didn't want the priest to be mad at them, so they didn't let us in. So we didn't have any success there, so we left and never did go back there. But then after about a year, I got transferred back to California, and I went to the town of Garden Grove, which is down in Orange County, close to where Disneyland is. And I had a good time there. I was there about 3 months. Had another really tremendous companion. His name was Elder Young, and he was from Idaho Falls, and we got along really well. And he had a lot of people that we were teaching, and we were on bicycles. And that was my first experience riding bicycles. Riding bicycles on the mission, and it was pretty tough for a while till I got used to it. But then I really kind of liked it because you was out kind of in the fresh air, and there wasn't much smog down in Orange County, but there had been up in West LA. So it was pretty nice, and we had a lot of good experiences there. We had one instance I remember where there was this little short street that had about 3 houses on each side of the street, and then it dead end into a big field that they were growing something in that field, probably marijuana. But we knocked on these 4 or 5 houses on the street. Nobody was home. They didn't. If they were, they didn't let us in, and so it was about time to quit. And so we thought, well, we'll stop and come back another day. And then Elder Young said, he says, let's just go a little further down this street and see what there is. You know, there might be some help. And so we did. We walked down to the end of the road, and down behind the last house, way out, kind of maybe, 40, 50 yards off the road, was this little tiny house. just a little house. And so he said, there's another house. So we went up and knocked on that, and this lady said, let us in. She let us in. She said, oh, she said, I've heard about the Mormons, and she said, come in and tell me about your church. A little old lady, oh, she wasn't that old. She was probably 50 or in her late 50s, early 60s, and she and her husband lived there by themselves. And we started going and teaching them, and they joined the church. So we baptized them, and we baptized, and then they brought their son, who lived, I don't know, in a little town close to there. And LA is all just one big town. You know, it's just, you can't tell when you leave one town and go into another. And he lived in the next place over. He was about, I don't know, 22 or so, about our age. And so they introduced him to us, and he came over, and we started teaching him. We baptized all the dad and the mother and him. And they were very good. Her name was Flynn. And they were very good members, and the members of the ward in Garden Grove, they had, in those days, they had one ward, and they met in the Masonic Temple on Sundays. And they were very accepting of these people. And then we had a couple other families that joined the church, and we had a good time in Garden Grove. And then I went to, then I was transferred. Elder Young went someplace else, and I had one other companion. And then I was transferred out of Garden Grove and went up to Bakersfield. And I had a good experience in Bakersfield, and we would go out to these little towns around like we had in Arizona, and talk to the people and knock on doors and stuff. And we went up to this little town of Porterville, which was pretty close to the very northern part of our mission. And Porterville was a little town, probably about like Linden too, about that size. And we found the bishop there, and we told him we were in town, and that we were going to knock on a few doors and see how things went. And he said, okay, he said, you can go. He said, I don't care, you can work here if you want. But he said, I don't want you going into what he called Dole Colony. And we didn't know what Dole Colony was, or where it was, or what it was, or anything about it. But we thought, because Porterville was right in the middle of a citrus growing area of California, they grew oranges and lemons and grapefruit and lime and all kinds of stuff. And we thought, well, Dole, that must be, we thought of that as being fruit, you know, like the Dole Pineapple Company or whatever. And so we thought, well, that must be what Dole Colony means. It must mean they're you know, it's a company type thing. But what it was an area of town where poor people lived. And then they called it Dole because most of them were on welfare, and in those days the welfare was known as the Dole. It was on the Dole. And but we didn't know where that was. And so and I had a car by then. I didn't tell you that. I got a car while I was in Garden Grove because they were going to transfer me to Bakersfield, and our area was from Bakersfield north to Porterville and west to the coast. So I had a great big area, huge area. And so we were driving down around to Porterville, and as we drove down this street, and my companion was Elder Cook. He was another great guy. We had a good time. And he said, we didn't know where to go or where to stop, you know. We thought, well, we'll just drive around a little bit. And so we're driving down this street, and he says, I don't know. He says, we might as well start knocking on any doors we can. He says, we might you never know, we might even baptize somebody and lives in that little house. And he points to this little green house that was there on the side of the road, kind of by itself, and the car stopped. Just stopped right in front of that house. I didn't put my foot on the brake. I didn't do any. I didn't turn the engine off. It just stopped right there. So I looked at him and he looked at me, and I moved the car off the road, parked it, and we got out and went up and knocked on that lady's door, or that house, that little green house. The lady opened the door, and no kidding, she had her phone book in her hand, and she said when she opened the door and saw us, she said, "Oh," she said, "you guys must be Mormon missionaries." And we said, "We are." And we didn't have name tags in those days. And so she says, well, she said, "I just moved in here from Northern California, and I'd seen missionaries up there, and she said, I'm just looking up the number of the address and number of the church here in Porterville, see if there is one." So we started teaching her. She joined the church. Another lady by the name of Sister Kelsey joined the church. We had a lot of success in Porterville, but there was one problem with Porterville, is that the ward, not the whole ward, but there was an element of the ward who, including the bishop, who looked down upon people who were not quite as well off as they were. And this lady lived on close to the old colony. Can't remember her name. I didn't think I'd ever forget her name, but she lived pretty close. We had another couple, a young couple, whose name was Rather, and he worked in the fruit warehouse there. They had a lot of orange processing places and things like that. He worked in one of the warehouses, and they didn't have much money, and but they were really nice people, and they were probably in their middle 20s, late 20s, and they joined the church, but the people in the ward didn't accept them, and they weren't very friendly to them, and we really felt bad because a lot of the people were, but not everyone. And so it was hard for them to go to church and stuff, and we weren't always in Porterville. We stayed there for a while, and then we would go back to Bakersfield, but we'd come up to Porterville. It was about 50 miles north of Bakersfield, and we would go up there. When we found out it was such a good place, we would go up there about 3 or 4 times a week and spend a day or two, or sometimes we'd stay overnight. There was members that let us stay overnight. And and then there was one time and I had 2 or 3 companions in that town, in that area. I was getting close to the end of my mission then, and there was this one time we went down the street, and there was a little cul-de-sac there, and we started to go through this area, and we were knocking on doors, and